My grades weren't too good when I was in high school and my SAT scores were bad. Here's the story. The colleges I would have considered if it wasn't for my main, secondary, and tertiary reason are really selective and hard to get into that require a big GPA and big SAT scores. Who knows on whether or not I would have gotten into them if I applied to them. If I would have gotten rejected from every college I applied to, then I would have attended community college fall semester of freshman year, which I wouldn't have been fond of. If it wouldn't have been for my main, secondary, and tertiary reason, I would have established this song called Red and White to send to the colleges I would have applied to as an attempt to get in faster, but who knows on whether or not this song would have been helpful enough to get into the very selective colleges as my grades were poor and my SAT scores were bad. Yale and Cornell are most selective schools. University of Michigan and University of Notre Dame are extremely selective schools. Penn State, Ohio State, University of Minnesota, UConn, and UMass Amherst are moderately selective schools. Freshman year of high school, my grades were poor because of my imagination wizardry depression. After I suffered all of those depressing issues occurring in school, family, and life in general, as an alternative to committing suicide, I chose to be a wizard and make things better by controlling and using magic since I was too young to have rights since I was a minor. It affected my grades as the only thing I focused on because of that was magic and imagination. If it wouldn't have been for all the depressing issues occurring in school, family, and life in general, then I would have focused on my grades more. Sophomore year of high school, I was disappointed that I was declined from chamber choir for the first time. I was declined because I was just struggling with sight reading due to the fact I have the ability to tell notes by ear and am more used to hearing notes rather than reading notes. I had no idea that was the reason and found it hopeless since I'm one of the best singers, 7 other sophomore boys made it in, and the only other junior boy who didn't make it in barely sings and is always on his phone. Usually juniors and seniors get the first priority of getting in, but when it's mostly sophomores who make it in over excellent junior and senior singers, it gets very hopeless. Students who are always on their phone and barely pay attention or sing get a less likely chance of getting in. I was very depressed and that affected my grades. My Uncle George's work was not going so well. They weren't making enough money as much as they used to, and because of that, George's boss made a terrible choice on having thoughts of selling the business for money. Because of that, George was offered a job in Los Angeles where he was the director. In April of my sophomore year of high school, George decided that he and his family will move to Los Angeles for a better job. I was so depressed because I didn't know about how I was going to see him and his family a lot since they're moving on to really far away. Los Angeles is on the other side of the country, and it's impossible for George and his family to visit a lot if they're all the way on the other side of the country. George and his family visiting Fairfield, Connecticut especially got hard because there are no extra bedrooms in the family, and it's triple the amount of work for my Aunt Diane to get ready for George to say, since my grandma already lives with her. If my grandma would have lived in a condo or a senior living home instead of a little apartment built onto the back of my aunt and uncle's house, it would have been 2 to 3 times easier for George and his family to stay. My aunt would have not been all worked up, so George and his family would have had a slighter chance of staying with my Aunt Diane. My grandma would have had a little bit more space at her place for George and his family to stay, and my grandma would have had a slighter chance of extra bedrooms if she lived in a condo or a senior living home, and then George and his family would have less likely spent money on a hotel or a rental home. It's harder for George and his family to be able to afford flying out since Darlene was no longer going to work. If Aunt Darlene would have worked and had a job when she moved out to LA, then the family would have gotten more money and then they would have been able to more likely afford flying out. That affected my grades sophomore year of high school too. Junior year of high school, I was struggling in Algebra 2 and Chemistry. Algebra 2 and Chemistry are really hard classes to take. I didn't know about how to get extra help, and I was worried that if I got extra help, I would have had to move back into the collaborative classes, which I didn't want to do. Sometimes, if you have an educational plan, they make certain accommodations, and accommodations if you're struggling in something. So I was worried that I would get an accommodation of collaborative classes if I was struggling in Algebra 2 and Chemistry. If they would have waited to add a co-teacher to the class if a student in the class has an IEP, instead of placing students in a class with co-teachers, then I would have been less stressed about getting extra help and would have gone for extra help for math and chemistry. My grades weren't too good after I was having a hard time in those classes, since I was struggling. My SAT scores were bad because the first time I took them, they got canceled after I rushed through. I was required to have extended time in my individualized education plan. Nobody told me ahead of time that my SATs were going to go all day, so I couldn't make an arrangement. Because of this, because I had no car on campus, and because I had play rehearsal after school, I went ahead, but this resulted in my scores getting canceled. If they would have told me ahead of time that I was going to go all day, then I would have made an arrangement for lunch schedule. The second time I took them, I was anxious about what happened the first time, so in result, my scores were bad. I didn't take the SATs multiple times because I was overwhelmed with their extremely strict policies on invalidating scores on things you have no control over, such as a medical condition and the fire alarm going off. If they only invalidated scores on things you have control over instead of things you have no control over, then I would have taken the SAT scores multiple times. The third time I took the SATs, I accidentally studied off the wrong material and got bad SAT scores once again. Nobody told me that it was just English and math. I thought it was for all subjects. If someone would have told me that it was just English and math, then I would have studied just English and math and wouldn't have studied for science and social studies.